Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the board and staff at the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance, I'm delighted to welcome you here today to our session on Future Ain't What It Used to Be, with our guest speaker, Chris Murray, the City Manager of Toronto. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the Director of IMFG here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank the sponsors of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maytree, the Province of Ontario, the City of Toronto, York Region, and Halton Region. I would also like to thank our team at IMFG for putting today's event together, Thomas Hatchard, our Manager of Programs and Research, and Ahmed Kawaja, who is our Administrator. I'd also like to thank the events staff and the technical staff here at the Munk School. If you are tweeting about this event, our hashtag is up here, IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFG Toronto. So I'm happy to say that today's presentation is the 8th annual IMFG event with the Toronto City Manager, and the second for Chris Murray. We host this event every year so that the City Manager can provide us with an update on what has been happening at the City, as well as enlightening us on future challenges and opportunities. Last year, Chris was pretty new to the job when he agreed to come and speak to us, but now he's served for more than a year at the City, so he is an expert. It is a good time to reflect on where Toronto has been and where it is headed. I think today Chris is going to focus mostly on future challenges and how we need to engage with others in the region to address these challenges. I am truly delighted to introduce our moderator for today, a colleague and friend, Anne Golden. I'm not sure Anne actually needs an introduction to this audience, because I think most of you know her from the GTHA Task Force report in 1996, the Homelessness Action Task Force report in 1999, both of which I had the privilege of working with Anne on, and the Premier's Transit Investment Advisory Panel report in 2013. Of course, these were all extracurricular activities for Anne, while she was president of United Way of Greater Toronto and later president and CEO of the Conference Board of Canada. Currently, Anne is Distinguished Visiting Scholar and Special Advisor at Ryerson University, where she serves as the chair of the Ryerson City Building Institute. I believe Anne is going to introduce Chris. He just gave her his bio while I was doing my introduction, and she will be our moderator today. Please welcome Anne Golden.
Thanks.
Good luck.
Thanks so much, Enid. It's such an honor to be here. And this has become now an important annual event, so congratulations to you and to Alan. And I'm delighted to have this chance to introduce this. And Enid asked me to say just a few words, and I will speak a little bit personally. You know, I have spent most of my professional life searching for solutions to the most critical problems that Canada's cities face. But I have to admit that the privilege of working on these public policy issues has been matched by my deep disappointment in witnessing our failure to make the requisite investments and reforms. You know, and just a few years ago, I was actually starting to feel optimistic. I always say I like to see the glass half full because I'm short. But at that time, I was starting to think we were on the threshold of a new era for cities. Why? Because there was a spate of new monographs on the urban resurgence and that testified to an explosion of interest in city building. The inventory that the Ryerson City Building Institute did of all of the, actually you funded that, Alan, of civil society organizations in the region. There were more than 230 activist organizations, advocating for progressive urban policies. We had smart mayors right across the country. We had renewed interest in the public realm, including parks and streets, waterfronts and laneways, and the whole notion of eco-design to accommodate growth without destabilizing natural systems was gaining acceptance. Here in Ontario, The proposed expansion of the Billy Bishop Island Airport was stopped by citizens seeking to protect the waterfront and adjacent communities. The province had committed to a major program of regional transit expansion, and Ottawa, the federal government, had said it was coming to the table as a significant and reliable partner with funding for infrastructure and affordable housing. So it seemed to me like a moment of opportunity to tackle our big issues, to embrace the emerging ideas for sustainable urban regions. However, to be honest, the momentum that I sensed is not continuing. Promised federal infrastructure funding has been mostly stalled, and in the single national leadership debate in the just past federal election, urban issues were conspicuously ignored. The possibility of a sustained and strategic focus by Ottawa on cities no longer seems likely. In Ontario, we seem to have reverted to a period of what I would describe as disempowerment, with provincial governments, not just this one, but the previous one, refusing to let Toronto City Council raise own source revenues through tolls and by cutting mid-election the size of City Council after the Council had revised its ward structure. Proposed provincial amendments to the provincial policy statement, which sets out Ontario's land use planning for managing growth and development, will likely lead to more sprawl, undercut the viability of public transit, worsen congestion, and weaken environmental protection. And proposed funding cuts to public health and social services, temporarily postponed, have worsened pressures on municipal budgets. In this context, I am extremely eager to hear Chris Murray's take on Toronto's challenges and opportunities. And I just want to say a word about Chris, who I didn't meet until today, but I was really thrilled. We've had a brief chat on the phone. Chris's background is, I think, perfect for the job he's in. He's an urban planner. He's had 10 years' experience as city manager of Hamilton. His professional background is in infrastructure and especially transportation. And he told me just prior to this meeting that he agreed with all of my reports. So he's a great, great guy. And with that, I introduce my new friend, Chris Murray.
Sam, terrific. Thanks so much. All right, I just have to make sure I'm operating the technology right. So first off, thank you to everyone who's here tonight. And I think Alan had said to me, last year I came across as optimistic, and so I've been in the job for a year, and I guess the question is, am I still optimistic? And the short answer is, of course I am. So today, some good news for all of you. I have about 15 slides. I'm going to try and get through this in a reasonable amount of time. I know Anne will have some questions for me, but the other important point here is to give you a chance to ask me questions that maybe we haven't thought of. So with that, my presentation is going to focus on just over a year's worth of learning in terms of Toronto, where it's at, where it's going. I also want to, though, talk more about this city region or city state that we're living in, and how it's evolving, and the importance of it, and importance of it certainly from a municipal standpoint, and then finally talk a bit about partnerships and what I think works and how it is. It's not so much the partnership that we have to and do have with the province and federal government, but really about a maturing of a partnership amongst municipalities. And Janice Baker is here tonight, the city manager of Mississauga, and I've had relationships with a number of the city managers and CAOs in Southern Ontario, and I must admit, I always thought when I was in Hamilton, any meeting I attended to, if Toronto was there, that was the center of the universe, and where the rest of us were just mere satellites. And so, but now that I have a chance to play the role that I play at the City of Toronto, there is an opportunity for us, I think, to work much more effectively together. Who doesn't love Yogi Berra? Yogi Berra has had obviously some of the classic quotes of all time, and if nothing else, what Yogi says will cause you to think, and the way he communicates usually sticks. When he says, when approaching the fork in the road, take it, what gets better than that? So So with the future, though, I think, as pointed out, there are obviously a number of challenges, and there are also, though, a number of opportunities that I really want to focus in on in the next few minutes. So some of you, I'm sure, are well aware of this, but right now there's about 3 million people that call Toronto home. We are the fastest growing city by a long shot in North America, and as a region, we are the second fastest growing. I know we have the most cranes that are active right now, and I know that the amount of development that's in the pipeline is significant. And so I must admit, I'm not used to the idea when someone wants to develop office space, they're talking in terms of millions of square feet, whereas most municipalities are, in total, if they have a few million square feet of office, that's usually success. But so the magnitude of what's in front of us is quite enticing. In terms of, though, how we're growing, and I think maybe this is the planner in me, the next 20 years, we are going to grow by about 1 million people. Just to put it in perspective, in the last year, we grew by 77,000 people here at the City of Toronto. And so a lot of that growth that you see in terms of residential development that's in the pipeline, a lot of it is occurring within about 5% of all the area within Toronto. So there's a heavy, heavy concentration of residential development, which, you know, when you look at areas of the city, including Scarborough, Etobicoke, and so forth, you know, it does beg the question, is there an opportunity to see more of the market unfold in those locations? And so we can talk about that. From a population standpoint, roughly in the GTHA, we're about 6.6 million people in total. We're going to grow to about 9.5 million. Toronto, as I say, is going to grow by 1 million, but our neighbor to the west, Mississauga, is going to grow by almost the same amount. If you look at the growth in Southern Ontario, in particular the GTHA, a lot of it is concentrated, obviously, in Toronto, Mississauga, and then there's more growth occurring west towards Hamilton. Certainly some growth in York region and some in Durham, but the concentration is mostly centralized, moving westwardly. And so that's an important consideration. And along with that, I just want to talk about the City of Toronto in terms of what's driving the growth. If it wasn't for immigration, we'd be in a declining population. And so if you look at cities or places like Manhattan, in fact, is losing population. We're growing simply because we have such robust attention and attraction coming into Toronto. Also, what we see happening is that our Provincial is growing as well. So there's a reason why you see a lot of Albertan license plates and maritime license plates, is a lot of people are finding their way to this part of Canada to call home. So that's, you know, keep that in mind. That's what's driving a lot of our growth. And this, in terms of spending per resident over the last 10 years, I mean, it's pretty much flatlined in 2019 dollars. Per capita operating spending adjusted for inflation is roughly about $4,500. And this is with us absorbing growth over that time period. But just to, again, to put it in perspective for you, in 2010, we were roughly 2.6 million people, and right now we're about 3. So we've added in the last 10 years, effectively, the population of Burlington and Oakville. Okay, so about 400,000 people. And if you think about the people that are coming to Toronto, they're immigrating to Canada, and a number or a good percentage are refugees. Their needs are different than certainly the needs of people living in Burlington and Oakville. And so that certainly does put pressure on the services that we provide. And it's important just to bear that in mind as we continue. So as I think Anne had pointed out, and those that have not read the Toronto Community Foundation Vital Signs report, you should. Important to note that despite our self-image, Toronto does not work for all, and I'll talk about that. Across the GTA, and this is again from United Way of Greater Toronto, middle-income neighborhoods are vanishing. And so there is, in my last time I was here, the theme of my presentation was about generational inequality, what's happening in terms of those that are are considered millennials or Generation Z, the decisions that we're making right now are going to have a profound effect on their ability to enjoy a quality of life that many of us in this room maybe have taken for granted. So we know that the middle class is shrinking. Some of that is a product of the economy, and some of that is a product of people in the middle class moving to other destinations within the GTHA. We also know from the nature of our work that increasingly jobs are precarious. So the idea of having a full-time paid benefits and index pension, those jobs are fast becoming rare, and that we know increasingly that people are struggling just to maintain part-time employment or contract-based work. And so we know that the tipping point is exceeded 50% of all jobs that are occurring within cities like Toronto. Housing affordability, I don't need to explain to anyone in this room what the cost of rentals are. But if you connect the thought back to precarious work, I mean, how does someone who is 25 or 30 years old go to a bank manager with a 3-year contract and expect to be given a $500,000 or $1 million loan when their employment is as precarious as it is? So we certainly know that this is a problem that we need to obviously turn our mind to and start to address in more meaningful ways, and I'll explain that in a second. Congestion, as you well know, we're not building more roads. The road capacity is pretty much as you see it. Unfortunately, in 2014, we finally exceeded the city of Los Angeles in terms of being one of the most congested in North America, in fact, the most congested. So if we're not adding lane capacity to the road, then obviously if we're going to accommodate another 1 million people, you're going to have to invest more significantly into transit. And so whether it's subways or LRTs, it is the mode by which we're going to be able to grow in the manner in which we're expected to grow. All of that to be said at the same time, as I pointed out earlier, our economy is doing things that most countries, let alone cities, would envy. And so it does beg the question, how is it that we can have this many challenges in a community like ours, where we have neighborhoods that are struggling, individuals, especially those that are in the 16 to 30-year range, are double-digit unemployment? How can you have that much challenge in a community where at the same time you have an economy that is doing what ours is doing? And how is it that we can make those jobs available to people who are now struggling? So that, I think, becomes a challenge not only the City of Toronto, but other levels of government, as well as other institutions. So Canadians, I don't think this comes as any great surprise. Canadians in general see government as both to blame and responsible for fixing the problems. And so, I must admit, I'm going to start to think about putting a disclaimer on any job offer that I make to someone in a senior level, because it's certainly being a municipal administrator, certainly a senior administrator, we do and are expected to read our names or see our names in print from time to time, whether it be in newsprint or in social media. And we are constantly given a reminder just how well we perform or don't. And that aside, I think if you're going to be a senior administrator in an organization, you have to accept that democracy has a price. And as individuals, we need to understand that we have to not just act professionally, but certainly act with courage if we're going to provide the kind of advice that we need to our decision makers. So this is an interesting challenge for us, but in some respects, it is in our hands as government to provide a way forward and to address the problems that we have to address. And so with that, last week, we did provide a document to the organization. I lead a group of civil servants that number in the order of about 37,000. Our annual budget, operating budget, is just over $13 billion, and our 10-year capital program is worth just north of $40 billion. I thought it was important, if you're going to lead a civil service, that you make clear what it is that you're trying to accomplish so that you can be focused and you can generate results. So the corporate strategic plan, and generally, and I'll say this as well, I don't typically celebrate plans. I rather focus on the actions that underlie the plan, but we have to start with a focus, and this is our focus. Certainly the vision and the motto and the mission were documented some time ago by council, and so that serves as kind of the overarching ideas that we need to strive for. So, and I won't read it to you, but if you want to, this is available online. The term trust and confidence, I think last time I was here, Conference Board of Canada about 20 years ago looked at the basic question of the private sector is about profit. What is the public sector about? What is it we're trying to earn? And the simple message that I provided to the organization that we're in the business of earning people's trust and confidence. And so that's something that every transaction that we make, every time we deliver a service, I don't care if you're a frontline worker or you're a city manager, you have to approach the way in which you deliver services with this concept in mind. In terms of the people, and if you were to look at my Monday morning agendas that I use to guide the conversation of our senior leadership team, I start with people. I'm going nowhere without leadership in this organization, and I'm going nowhere without a front line that's engaged. And so workplace culture is something that actually quite matters. If you don't define it, it'll define you. And so about a year ago, we did in fact ask the question in 20 words or less, what kind of organization you want to work for. So we've established a workplace culture that I hold senior leadership accountable for delivering. Partnerships is, aside from being a professional planner and someone that's spent a lot of time in infrastructure, transportation, but also as a housing director, I think my whole career has been made or broken, if you will, on the backs of how well partnerships work. And given the nature of the challenges that we face, whether it be individuals or neighborhoods struggling in poverty, or it be the challenges that we're facing in an economy that does not favor everyone, the answer at the end of the day is going to be found through partnerships, and I'll talk about that in a second. Performance, at the end of the day, we are given money and people expect value for that money. And so we have established in our document as well something called results-based accountability approach to demonstrating performance. So it's really important to me that I'm able to explain to you how it is that your money is being spent and how effective we are. And then finally, of course, priorities. I like 3, I have 6, but I'll live with 6. 3 is a good number for me. The 6 priorities I'm going to talk about right now. So as I think Anne was saying earlier, the walking of the talk, from a priority standpoint, on the right-hand side, you see financial sustainability. We will be reporting back to a committee on this in December about our long-term financial sustainability. It was one of the first things that I was asked to focus on when they chose to hire me. And so we are doing a number of things, and this is just by way of example. We are engaged right now in a budget modernization exercise where we want to become more service-focused. We also want to engage in multi-year budgeting. Our capital program is a multi-year program, but operating is basically year by year. I'm cognizant of organizations that develop a kind of a live another day strategy, and I think it's important that our budget modernization be more multi-year so that we understand not just where we are, but where we're going and how we're going to accomplish that. I'm looking at the capital plan budget. What I find interesting is that the $41 billion 10-year plan, I look at it from a year-to-year standpoint, and we spend somewhere between 60 and 63%, which from a municipal perspective, I know other municipalities that usually top 80% or better. So we want to look at why is it that we're accomplishing the 60 to 63. So we'll be reporting to council on that. So these are some of the things that we need to focus on, as well as the revenue tools, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Continuously improving services is a fundamental component of a well-run city. So, as much as running a city means evolving it from, a paper-based type service to one that is more digital, it's also about improving on the leadership that's provided in the organization. It is about process engineering. It is about a lot of the work that the city's been doing over the last several years and just continuing to evolve it so that, that when we demonstrate to people that their money's well spent, it's not just about the here and now, it's about future challenges that we're going to face and how is it that we're going to be able to manage the kinds of evolving challenges that this population is presenting. So there is a whole host of things that do become part of a well-run city. Maintaining and creating housing that's affordable. I mean, we are doing everything from revamping Toronto community housing because we're now looking at taking the seniors' residences, and we are looking to create a different governance model. In some respects, we're kind of right-sizing Toronto community housing. And along with that, we're looking at what its core functions ought to be, which is a great landlord. So as a corporation, it's important to us that they run the largest housing entity in Canada in a manner that best addresses the needs of its citizens. So we are looking at taking from it the development function and putting it with Create TO. So there's a number of things happening with respect to that entity. But also we are looking to try and add to the number of affordable units in Toronto. And this isn't strictly the City of Toronto, but about 40,000 units over the next 10 years. Transit expansion, no doubt, in order to keep Toronto moving. Transit is a major component of it, no doubt. Last week you heard of a report that was approved by Council, which has us at a table with the province to make sure that we are able to not just expand the transit system, but also address a $33.5 billion challenge that we have with the existing system, and that we need to keep in mind that in order to maintain in a decent state of repair, we have to spend a sizable amount of money, which I must admit, Rick Leary, the CEO, when I first met him, I think for the first 3 or 4 months, I thought our challenge was in the order of about $7 or $8 billion. And then in January, he said, no, it's about 33.5. So I said to Rick, I don't know if I'm going to trust another number you give me. But that aside, it's when you think about the city's overall capital program worth $41 billion, and all of a sudden you wake up one day and you know you have a $33.5 billion problem, and you think you're going to address that with the revenue tools that you've had, think again. So when I talk about Toronto moving, I don't want anyone in this room thinking it's just about transit, because when I think about moving, I think about people and goods movement. So it is about striking the balance between the automobile, the transit user, and the other modes of transportation, walking, cycling. All has to come together if we're going to be able to grow to the extent we're supposed to grow. And of course, poverty reduction strategies. We absolutely, if we want to make sure that our people in our neighborhoods are successful, we got to continue to address everything from the refugee challenge that we face to the racialized populations and the challenges that they face, to a whole host of things that Torontonians know needs to have attention. I mean, I know every morning that I come to work, the number of people I find that are sleeping on our sidewalks, difficult to accept. I certainly, when I first came here in '87, it wasn't like this. And what I see, and we travel quite a bit around the world, and the homelessness problem that Toronto's facing will only go in one direction if we don't have a strategy for addressing that, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And of course, climate change and resiliency. So we do have a resiliency strategy. We are integrating that into the work of Transform TO. So again, it's the here and now of climate change that we can't ignore, and we're investing literally hundreds of millions of dollars in engineering works to try and address the challenges of flooding and all of that. But I would also argue that the investment we need to make in climate change and in resiliency is to address the generations to come. I know from an ISO standpoint, resiliency is now a new standard. And what's driven that was the insurance industry worldwide wanting to know which cities have their act together when it comes to addressing climate change. Because it's not just an environmental thing, it's clearly an economic thing, that those cities that choose to ignore it are going to be left behind when it comes to making major investment. So this picture, if you did not live in Toronto, did not know anything about Southern Ontario, this is what you would see. And the reality is that this landmass of ours, this GTHA, this golden horseshoe, has been urbanizing for quite some time. And you can start to see that the boundaries are really almost irrelevant. because people that live within these gray areas, they live there, but they also work there. And so their ability to move around this region is becoming increasingly more important. And so when we last week received direction to continue working with the provincial government on the matter of transit, I will say this about the terms of reference that's guiding our work. There's really three streams to it. The first was the matter of upload. Clearly, the City of Toronto did not want its subway system uploaded, and the province initially did, so we have addressed that. The second was about expanding transit in Toronto, and so there are the 4 projects that the province is focused on. There are other projects that the city wants to have the province consider. And as you know, the province is going to put its money in expansion and is going to allow us to redirect our dollars into state of good repair and bring forward business cases for expansion of other lines within Toronto. And so transit, those 2 items, upload and expansion. The third item that I don't think got very much attention and is one that I think is incredibly important is the agreement between the province and ourselves in this document to look at transit from a governance standpoint and a revenue standpoint, a regional governance and revenue standpoint. So what that does, it opens a door for me to start to engage my colleagues like Janice and other city managers and CAOs within this region, if you will, to start thinking about how transit can be delivered. And it strikes me that, and I can tell by the people in the room, that you'll remember the commercial, I think it was for Life brand cereal, where the 3 brothers were sitting at the breakfast table in the morning, and the mother came in to try the new breakfast on them. And the oldest brother would say, I'm not going to eat it, you try it. And the middle child said, I'm not going to eat it, you try it. And they go, wait a minute, give it to Mikey, he eats everything. I think in some respects, municipalities have become Mikey. It seems that we are the ones at the end of the day that are being downloaded services, whether it be housing or other matters, and expected to deliver them with a very finite set of revenue tools. And so I'm going to suggest that maybe what needs to happen is that municipalities that are sharing common challenges need to start talking to each other and maybe formulating strategies to present to the province and to the federal government. Waiting for them to come up with the right governance model and answer for us to accept, I think, is not really the best approach moving forward. And I can remember chairing what we called the Western Golden Horseshoe municipalities. A number of us were quite concerned that goods movement was being ignored. And quite frankly, there really isn't a goods movement strategy to speak of that's guiding action in Southern Ontario. But this group of CAOs and myself got together and talked to MTO about putting together a goods movement strategy. And so that's something that they are doing. So I do maintain that there is a chance for municipalities, maybe it's a bottom-up approach, but I think that's important. And in fact, it bears out from a transportation standpoint, a transit standpoint, some work that Eden did with an advisory group to the city that looked at in different regional transit models from around the world that have worked or have at least elements that are attractive. So we do have an opportunity, I think, as municipalities to talk to each other about how it is that we could maybe propose a way in which to better manage transit. And with that, have a conversation with the province and federal government about the revenue tools that we think would be useful if we're going to provide sustained service. And so I think most people, when you ask them that are traveling around Southern Ontario, they just want a reliable service. They want a quality service. I don't think they care especially what logo is on the side of the vehicle. They just want to make sure that if they go from A to B, that it's as easy as possible and that their devices don't have to constantly be checked and prodded or whatever we're doing right now, that there is this notion of service and fare integration. And maybe the people that are best able to kind of knit that together are municipalities. And so we are not obviously ever going to forget the partnership that we have. I mean, we are creatures of the province, so we will continue to work with the federal and provincial government. I would maintain that the table that we have right now on transit is working. In fact, it's going to work even harder. I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of delivering on all that we have to deliver from a transit standpoint in Toronto, but certainly having tables where we're able to, share ideas and work through them is important. And then this matter of what I call intersecting issues and common challenges. So, and I'll start with the middle one, health and housing, by way of example. As a director of housing and former CEO of City Housing Hamilton, what you learn pretty quickly is that, at a municipal level, you have oversight or control of the bricks and mortar. But anyone that has worked in housing knows that it's the people that live in the housing and their needs that go well beyond the bricks and mortar. And oftentimes, those services aren't necessarily controlled by the municipality. They're often controlled by the province. So we are, in case of Toronto, we've got a memorandum of understanding with the University Health Network and United Way and ourselves to start to knit together these different agencies and entities to start looking at better service integration. And so one of the first things that you're seeing is certainly the University Health Network looking at some of its own land and looking at an opportunity to develop that land for service support or assisted housing, so that people that are in hospitals that don't have an easy path home to be taken care of can go to a form of housing that their needs will be met, and allowing for more capacity within the hospital system to deal with the ever-increasing volume of people that are coming. And so I think it's these kinds of approaches that are going to be really important, that we work as institutions with each other trying to achieve common outcomes. As far as infrastructure and climate change, I mean, we are making heavy investments right now, but there's clearly linkages between the types of infrastructure we build and their effect on climate change. And so maybe one of the most obvious is certainly transit. It's inconceivable to think that we're going to be able to grow to the extent we are, and that growth be principally supported by the automobile. And regardless of what Uber and AI is going to do at the end of the day, it's hard to imagine cities growing without heavy investment in transit infrastructure. So those matters are linked, and those are things that we are clearly linking together, but also working with the province in a partnership, as I mentioned. And of course, growth and investment. How you grow a city by 1 million people with as much development that is being contemplated without an investment strategy that goes maybe beyond the tools that we have. It was remarkable to me that over the last 10 years, a lot of the growth that we've achieved, the 400,000 people, we have done it while maintaining effectively an inflationary increase in our budget. So we've done that, I think, through some efficiencies, but it does beg the question, if you're going to achieve the kind of success that we've had over the last 10 years, and we're going to deal with the complexities of our society, how are we going to do that without different investment strategies? And then finally, what the success to me, I mean, at the end of the day, is about competing and conflicting interests versus the information exchange. So this is a very simple diagram, which I think sums up in my mind when you have institutions working together, whether they be different levels of government or they be institutions themselves that are, let's say, effectively in the same space that a city would be. And that is, if you can find shared interests and you're open to sharing information at the table, you have a better chance of having success than if your interests are in conflict and you choose not to talk to each other and share information. So it seems so simple, but over my career, I've had a number of opportunities to work on very challenging undertakings with interests that were certainly opposed at the very beginning. My background in conflict resolution is more aligned to interest-based negotiations. And what I find is that if we can establish early on what our shared interests might be, and if we can create a table where we respect each other and trust each other and share information, in time you usually can figure out the answer. It doesn't mean it always works, but certainly that's usually a good place to start. So thank you for the time, and I know Anne will have a few questions for me, but hopefully I've left enough time for questions that all of you might have. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A great overview. I'm going to ask about 3 or 4, perhaps a little bit tough questions, but I want to open it up to because you probably have questions and comments as well. You definitely described the challenges, massive growth, the congestion, the infrastructure deterioration, the growing inequality. But I want to sort of drill down on that. I think the point you made about we've absorbed massive growth, but keeping spending constant is really important. But we have buried so many of those costs. The 30 billion plus price tag that, for TTC alone repairs, and those of us that take the TTC now, you can see it's actually noticeable, the service issues. Asset management in general, when you have this level of growth. I guess my question is, and I know, and you've put a very positive spin on this in terms of the plan and everything, but what can you really do if you don't have the money and you don't have the power?
So, I mean, Toronto, through the Toronto Act, has revenue tools that I know other municipalities don't have. Now, the nature of those revenue tools, as you know, some of them are fully within our control and others aren't. The idea that you're going to be able to grow the city and, with the infrastructure that it needs to accommodate 1 million people, and at the same time address an aging infrastructure is magic. And so I think that's why at this point in time, there has to be a recognition that the tools themselves, even the ones that are available to Toronto and the ones that are under its control, won't be enough to be able to address the backfall in state of good repair costs for our infrastructure. And I must admit, on an asset management standpoint, the cities that are older, like of a Toronto vintage, like a Hamilton, before it ever became a requirement of the province, a number of them had jumped on the asset management wagon to get an understanding of just what its state of good repair was all about. And especially when you don't have a lot of growth happening in your community and not a lot of money, you want to know how serious a problem do you have when it comes to asset management. And so the level of maturity of some of these systems that are out there in Ontario are quite mature. I would say we are not 100% there when it comes to understanding the full extent of our asset management challenge, let alone how we're going to solve it. And so when someone shows up one day with a report that says it's not 7 or 8 billion, it's 33.5, I mean, that puts you in a whole different league. You can't nickel and dime your way out of that. That will not get solved in just a simple, increase of your property tax by 1 or 2% more than inflation. It just won't work that way. So it is time, I think, to have that conversation. Now, I'm not optimistic for the sake of being optimistic. It's not my way, but I do think the conversations that we're starting to have, at least on transit, where there's recognition the province and the federal government ought to be taking care of the expansion. It still begs the question of $33.5 billion left on the shoulders of Toronto. So there has to be a conversation about that. But again, this is why I think we have to look at transit not as strictly as a City of Toronto problem, because how society makes decisions is interesting. I mean, if you look at Walkerton, 7 people died and about 2,000 were poisoned. And for a sustained period of time, the media certainly did its job in bringing that to everyone's attention. And that eventually led to municipalities being able to, in Toronto's case, a 9% rate increase over 9 years. That doesn't just happen. But unfortunately, there was that backdrop of something as serious as Walkerton that led to people knowing that if we don't invest properly in our water, wastewater infrastructure, that maybe that could happen to us as well. And you see it happen in other major infrastructure, when bridges fall down, next thing you know, we're now talking about asset management. And I hope to God it never happens, but just imagine for a second if Line 1 went down for a month. How would we get around? You would never be able to put enough buses on the road to address a Line 1 being down for a month. And when your system is 60 plus years old, and just how fragile is it? That becomes the question. And I think, you don't ever want to wait till you're in that situation. And that's why I think, the conversation with other municipalities about transit, as a regional service and how it ought to be funded sustainably is a conversation I first think has to begin with municipalities and us to come up with an answer as to how it is that we will maintain control over it, but at the same time engage other levels of government in what is a fundamental element of the regional economy. And I'll end with this because it's a long answer, but when you look at the CMA, Toronto Census Metropolitan Area, which is effectively the GTA, and you look at the GDP generated by just that area, I'm not talking about GTHA, I'm just talking about the GTA, it's almost equivalent to Alberta and almost equivalent to Quebec. And that isn't to suggest that we should, split from the country or anything like that. It's simply to say this is a massive economic engine, one that needs to be invested in. And it kind of begs the question as to how it is that the three levels of government could actually create a more sustainable, better governed transit system.
We're totally on the same page on this. When I was at the conference board, we did a study on this whole infrastructure deficit. Now, and debt. And the interesting thing that I learned was that basically from World War II up till about 1976, we were investing in infrastructure development across the country at the same rate as the population was growing, about 5% a year. And starting in 1976, when the federal government wanted to cut back, we reduced that to about 0.1% a year. And it didn't increase again until the year 2000. There's no wonder that we're behind this huge 8-ball. And this is a conversation that absolutely has to be had, because you mentioned 33 billion or 32 billion for transit. Just some, wasn't it today or yesterday, lead in the water now. Every single day, and we are not addressing this question as a country, as a province. Several reports have been written, including the one that I chaired on transit options. Other organizations have put forward serious on investment options. Other organizations, but we're in a, when you look at the total political climate, it's one that favors, they want tax cuts and heads are in the sand. So it's, just to cheer you up further. Well, I thought to myself, one thing the city could do is to reprioritize its spending. And I know it's challenging politically, but some of us have been concerned about, proposals to bury the Eglinton West extension. Of course, there's the whole discussion of the Scarborough, which is very political. But that's billions of dollars being spent where business cases cannot be made that could be invested in Vision Zero or Transform Toronto. Not enough to do the affordable housing, on its own, but it could be partly applied to that. Do you think there's any possibility of reconsidering some of those decisions?
Well, I mean, the province has passed legislation making clear it's for projects.
Yeah.
So it's,
Unlikely.
Right. I mean, I use the word notwithstanding, but everyone would understand.
Yeah, right.
So I mean, that is clear. The legislation is clear that is their priority. So I mean, as an administrator, decision makers make decisions and they direct accordingly. So, I don't think that is something that is, unless there's a change in view on that. But can I just say one thing? I remember, a few years back, I was invited to a meeting that was that featured Paul Martin, and Paul Martin was talking about the fiscal situation the federal government was facing in the 90s, and he said something that I think is maybe its time has come again to think about, and that is, and to do, is he said they spent about 18 months socializing the challenge that they were facing and what that would mean in terms of the federal government being able to not just address the fiscal situation, but also what it might mean to programs it would have to revisit. And so he seemed to place a lot of emphasis on the socialization of that message to Canadians. And I wonder, in terms of, as we move forward and change our our approaches to governance and change our revenue approaches, that maybe a bit more time needs to be, because I have faith ultimately in our Canadian brothers and sisters that you know, when given a clear set of facts and given time to, you know, query the facts, I think far too often we rely on the great technical work that gets done, but something gets lost in the translation when it comes to making sure that, you know, that maybe the person that doesn't spend all their time, you know, poring over, you know, city budgets or anything, you know, how much do they understand about the challenge that we're facing and what it might mean to their children and their children's children. And I think if we maybe spend a bit of time as we're having these discussions with the federal and provincial government about their role, that might be, as Paul Martin successfully did, I think in the 90s, that might be a way to help people understand the importance of not relying on a regime of revenue tools that are pretty well exhausted and won't give you an easy answer to the challenges that you're facing.
I think that's a very big point. I studied history for 10 years, and somebody once asked me a question, well, what did you learn from studying history? And I had 1 minute to answer, and I said, I learned that change only occurs when the climate of opinion changes. Yeah. And sometimes you get a radical event that will change climate of opinion, like a Pearl Harbor or like a 9/11. But generally speaking, it takes a lot of effort to educate, and that's what a lot of people in this room here are part of organizations or governments with trying to get this message across. But that is something that municipal leaders and public officials can do. Yep. Just a third question. When you listed your priorities and you put a lot of emphasis on thinking beyond municipal boundaries, how do you think beyond municipal boundaries without the appropriate governance? Now, a number of us have worked together on governance restructuring many times over. So I thought I would take today and just, no. But collaboration and partnerships are hard to do. And I do notice that Mississauga and Toronto, with your mayor too, tend to be more on the same page, a change from decades ago that I recall, which is great. How do you make that happen, really, when you don't have the governance set up to reinforce it?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you probably know the answer better than I, but I think it was a question I asked our city solicitor in terms of the Toronto Act, or more importantly, I think the Municipal Act and municipalities' ability to create agencies. I mean, the agencies don't have to be specific to just the municipality itself. It can actually, it can transcend boundaries. So if there's a legal tool that we could look at if we want to create those structures. But it kind of goes back to my last slide. I mean, what is the shared interest? I think there's a shared interest around transit. I don't think boiling the ocean is going to be especially useful or governance for the sake of governance. I think it's really about the focusing on a service that, whether you live in Halton or you live in North York or you live in Durham or wherever. I mean, increasingly this transit system that we're building, that we're investing billions and billions of dollars, it's got to be simple. I mean, fair integration has got to be, we got to make it as easy as possible. Form follows function in many ways, and so, I kind of look at, the opportunity to sit down with other municipalities. And I mean, it'll be a very short discussion if there isn't some legitimacy or some seriousness given to the idea of revenue, different ways of approaching revenue, and I don't want to start talking about which tools I think would make the most sense. I want to kind of, at least start the process of having the conversation. But I think it's something that, I think council is expecting and the province is expecting through the terms of reference that during this term of government that we come to some conclusion on this. How it gets communicated to the people that live in Southern Ontario, what happens with it, we'll have to see. But what's the alternative? The alternative is you have 10 municipalities and the provincial government acting almost as independent agents, trying to deliver service that is, vital to, people's equity. And, think about, seniors that are aging in their homes. I mean, At the end of the day, social isolation is a very expensive proposition. If for no other reason, people's ability to move around their community is absolutely vital. And so, and people's ability to, afford to get to work in a reasonable amount of time. That's not going to get solved if 10 municipalities in the province are continuing to act as independent agents. So now's as good a time as any to focus on it.
One last question before we open it up, Chris. A more personal question. What is life like for the public service with the new structure, with the reduced size, with the council that's been cut in half? Is the new reduced council working? Does the mayor listen to you?
Well, the first part of your question is, and when this was all unfolding, I thought to myself, if I ever get asked that question, what would I say? And well, I mean, the bottom line is that, I'm here to serve whoever's elected, right, whether it's 25 or 47. So I'll leave it at that. I serve 25 members of council and the mayor. That's been how I operate. In terms of...
Is it harder for you? Or perhaps
no.
easier?
I am so thankful that I had a chance to work as a city manager in a single-tier municipality that amalgamated. Services are services. When you're a single-tier, the differences are the zeros. There's more zeros in Toronto. Those budgets are a lot bigger. But the service itself, except for a zoo and a few other things, I've dealt with most of this in Hamilton. So you learn something about that. And the other thing that you learn really quickly in this job is that you have to build a relationship with every member of council and the mayor. And whether you're left or right, however people perceive our elected officials, I'm indifferent to any of that. I want relationships with each one of them. And as I say to each one of them when I meet them, and I say this sincerely, I go, I have no idea why anyone would put their name on a ballot. That is the craziest thing I can even possibly imagine. And you laugh, but I'm telling you, they live a heck of a life. That's 7 days a week. These people are known in their community. Whenever people approach them, it's never a good conversation.
Sorry.
So all I'm saying is that I have a tremendous amount of respect and empathy for anyone, whether you agree with their politics or not. I have a tremendous amount of respect for anyone that decides to make this their living or make this their life choice. So, at the end of the day, you want to provide them the best information possible. And of course, my simple statement to staff is that imagine whatever it is you're saying, that you got to defend it in front of a judge or a tribunal. It's as simple as that. The idea of political spin or whatever like that, it's if you want to earn trust and confidence, you'll never achieve that if you're politicized. You've got to give the answer that you can defend. It's in some respects as simple as that. Whether or not Mayor Tory's listening to me or any other member of council, I have my own opinion. It's probably a question you have to ask them. But at the end of the day, if I wasn't being taken seriously in the direction that we're going to go, and I was just spinning my wheels, life is too short, I'd go do something else. But I love what I get to do. I'm working with some incredibly gifted and committed civil servants. No big surprise. Toronto's, lucky to have the people that it has that are in these key portfolios. Our job right now is to not just deliver on day-to-day services, but to look at how this population is changing and look at its challenges and give council the best advice we can. But more importantly, I'd say learn how to work with others to, I look at the downloading or the 2019 budget pressures that we're all facing in terms of, cuts to childcare, cuts to public health. And what happened in that exercise was not just the City of Toronto saying that there was a problem with this and being quite critical. City of Toronto worked quite well with the municipalities in Southern Ontario to get its message out. That was not an independent municipality. That was a group of municipalities that shared common interests. And so something happened. And I would suggest that we got to get used to working that way.
Right. Let's open it up. Questions, comments? Yes, sir. Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Well, just behind you, and then we'll do you next. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for the talks. Very
I don't know if your mic is on.
Testing.
There we go.
There we go. Thank you very much. I found the talk very insightful, and I agree with you. Back in 1987, we didn't see nearly as much homelessness as we do in Toronto. So it's a big concern, because I heard recently that in Helsinki, Finland, they've been able to eradicate homelessness altogether by creating affordable housing units for all on a very much smaller scale than you would expect here. But you mentioned that over the next 10 years that we expect about 1 million people will be immigrating here, and that is about 100,000 per year. But when we're only providing 40,000 affordable units over the next decade, it means that only 4,000 units will be available for 100,000 people. A lot of people who come here face barriers, such as language barriers. Employment skills are not easily transferable for many qualified people. Some end up working as taxi cab drivers, and so it's very difficult sometimes to transition. I think that we're going to need a whole lot more than just 40,000 of affordable spaces over the next decade. The number might be as high as about 500,000. Is there a way to reconcile that?
So the 40,000 is over 10 years, the million is over a 20-year period. It still represents a massive challenge. So in terms of household income and what can we do to improve that, I mean, if there's one thing that probably does cause me some sleep loss, is the fact that we have such an aggressive infrastructure build program and maintenance program, and I worry, given the age of the skilled labor population, are we going to have enough people to build all this? And where is the training, and where is the effort that needs to be made to maybe convince people that live in our communities that there is an economic future in the skilled trades? And so I do wonder from a union standpoint and universities and colleges and training school standpoint, what is the game plan? Because I don't think it's as clear as it needs to be in terms of the kinds of needs that are present now and are going to continue. So I mean, one of the things is, and providing more affordable housing. I mean, I know our planning department is looking at ways in which it can incent or it can encourage the private sector to provide for more units in the market. I mean, the 40,000 I'm talking about are new builds. I mean, I think there's, right now, I don't think there is as complete an answer to your question in terms of the supply of housing as we need. I think increasingly people are finding housing opportunities outside of Toronto. That's what we see, because it tends to be a bit more affordable, although the trade-off is longer commute times and the cost of transit, which is why I think we need to look at transit in a different manner. In fact, I will tell you that I think housing and transit, those two things go hand in hand, and that if there's a regional strategy, it ought to look at both. So, I mean, that's kind of my short answer to your question. I just think there's a lot more that has to be done, and it's not as clear as it is right now to me as to how we are going to, in fact, address the skilled labor problem.
Question up front here, and then you'll be next.
Thank you, and thanks for the Monk School for making this happen. You mentioned many years ago there was an alignment. The rate of infrastructure investment was pretty good, matched population growth. Could you continue the history lesson and give some insight into why did that happen then? What changed to get us to where we are? So a little bit of background into how did municipalities come together to allow the rate of infrastructure investment that we had at the time that you mentioned, and how did that change? Why are we here now?
Why did we start to reinvest in 2000?
So yes, you mentioned that previously the rate of infrastructure investment matched population growth.
Right.
That's not the case now.
It started to shift in Ontario. Right. It was really just, I can't say who took credit for it, but it was really Dalton McGuinty that turned that around a bit. And there was a decision by Ontario to do some reinvestment. And that was, remember, that was the time when they were building the whole growth plan, et cetera. And there was a lot of thought, the whole theme of regional planning. Again, we've gone through sort of periods, and there's people in this room that will remember when I was first started myself in this whole area, it was 1966. Anybody here remember Design for Development, Toronto-centered region planning? I see faces in the room from then. And it was all the rage. We all knew that development was going to go west to Peel, and there was a lot of thought and a lot of really growth management, how we were going to manage the growth. And then we let go of that, and that was disbanded. In the 70s, they ended that whole provincial program, and then growth just happened. Then the growth management plan of the last decade was really hailed around the world as very positive. It was a model for growth management. We've done very well. Now there's a new public policy statement coming out, and some concerns I raised earlier about where it's going to go, but the actual framework is terrific if we could just stick to it. On the housing front, Enid and I had a chance to work on that just at the end of the last century. And we had a plan that we say modestly would have worked. But it takes a lot. There has to be investment and incentives. The fact is, you have to somehow bridge that gap between what it costs to produce the housing and allow the developers some profit and what it can be rented for. And there's different ways of doing that. There's not just one answer to it, but various incentives, various cut taxes, various ways of of capitalizing your expenses for the developers. But we did put together a package that could have worked. It just wasn't done. And not because we couldn't afford it, I would argue. It just wasn't done. It's very complicated for the public to understand. I think it just didn't have, sex appeal to the public. It is complicated making policy and getting it implemented. Did you want to comment on this before we go to?
Yeah, I thought your question was why did we stay at the level of funding that we were back in the day, and then what caused it to drop off?
Yeah, what we had an alignment.
Right.
That changed.
Yeah.
Well, in 1976, it became federally. There was a program to just cut public spending. It was felt that the public spending was too high, and the mood shifted. And I forget the name of the program federally that they introduced, but they began to look for ways to cut public spending. And cutting infrastructure investment it didn't show at first.
Well, exactly, and I think this is the problem with asset management. I mean, if you don't maintain that steady investment in maintenance, then you're caught, and this is why the next generation, I think, is going to have a heck of a time try to maintain all the infrastructure that is necessary to sustain our quality of life. If they're spending all of their tax dollars basically replacing infrastructure that should have been properly maintained. And I found it interesting that, in the 90s, the net operating cost of transit was subsidized. Not fully, but in part by the province, and so was capital. And for some that will remember as well, we had pooling. I mean, we had a situation where, Toronto is, the epicenter for people that, are sometimes facing some of life's most horrific challenges. And so we do have services here, which is a good reason why they should be here. But in terms of how you pay for all of that, again, it's something that was was being funded in a particular way, and that changed. So I mean, again, I think before too long, it's going to beg the question. Is there a chance to kind of revisit some of the the investments that the province and federal government ought to make, and do we have enough tools, and why do the other municipalities in Southern Ontario not have access to the same revenue opportunities that we do? Would it make sense for them to have within Southern Ontario the same collection of revenue tools that we have? So, and with without all the strings attached.
Question at the back there, please.
Thank you. First of all, let me say I heard pretty much, I like pretty much everything you said, and I don't say that easily. So thank you very much for that. So 2 quick questions. One, what do you think of the charter city concept for Toronto? Do you think that would help moving forward? And the other one is, what do you think of a Toronto-owned public bank as a way of financing some of the infrastructure that we need?
So I'm familiar with the charter cities approach. I think, it's one of those things that, and this will sound very bureaucratic, so I'm going to lose all your support in 1 second here. If we're directed, I think it's one of those things that I think we would like to weigh in on and provide some direction or advice to council on that. I know there's a few members that are championing it. Obviously it has some merit. And in terms of, I'm not really familiar, to be honest with you, your second comment. It's not one I could honestly sit here and speak with any kind of real grasp of it. So I'd rather not answer that question simply because I don't know.
Other comments, question? What was the second comment? I missed your second comment.
About the municipal bank. Just your second.
Oh, I just wondered if you had an opinion about a Toronto-owned public bank. Councillor Long Tam, I think, champions that. It's literally a bank owned by Toronto, which with about $5 billion of investment can then be leveraged into the ability to lend, from what I can see, up to $50 billion. And that money could be lent to the municipalities as well as investments in the public interest through business and things like that.
Right.
And in fact, the interest collected, well, first of all, the interest could be set by Toronto, and the interest collected could go back into the city's coffers. I think it's done elsewhere in the world, and it's a very efficient way of leveraging the resources that Toronto has. As you well know, I think the Toronto Investment Board has a portfolio of something like $12 billion, so we certainly have the money to start something like that. And it might be just a very efficient way of and accessible way of finding the investment that we could use for the infrastructure that we want.
Other comments and questions? Yes, over here.
Yes. Good evening. Thank you again. So I work on the infrastructure repair and maintenance side of things, not for the city, but for the federal government. And I was wondering if you could speak to the disconnect that exists to those of us on the front line who have to deal with the nuts and bolts of things and the lack of necessary input we can give through policy up to not just people in policy, but also politicians and so on and so forth. It is quite frustrating to be sitting with very expensive pieces of equipment and not being able to properly maintain them on the engineering side. The devil, so to speak, lies in the detail. Plans are great, but you have to make them work. Right.
So I learned from experience. First of all, I was in consulting for a number of years, and as a urban planner, I had this great idea that one day I took to my boss and I pitched my idea, and he said, "No, we're not going to do that." And which, first of all, I respected the fact he gave me a straight answer, not that he wouldn't. It was the idea of integrating land use and infrastructure planning following basically an environmental assessment framework. So the idea that you would evaluate alternative ways of growing a city and then deciding which was the most appropriate and then basing your official plan and infrastructure plans on that framework. So Hamilton actually ended up doing this. It's something called growth-related integrated development strategy. And so I joined Hamilton not because I had this great, passion for working on another road project, which is why I got hired, but I was given an opportunity to go chase an idea. And I basically took a cut in pay of about 25% and demotion in terms of the hierarchy. I was a manager in consulting, and I was a frontline unionized planner in Hamilton Wentworth. But it was, we were given a chance to pitch an idea. And so we within the organization, identified a few key senior leaders that we thought we could pitch the idea to. And we said, you take all the credit. We don't need the credit. Just, see if you can't bring this to the commissioners and to the CAO. And they did. And it took a couple of years after that for the idea to be implemented to become grid. So, I mean, there are ways within an organization for people in the front line to be heard. So I think that's the first thing. I think, the second thing is organizations that are so top down, that are only listening to a very few people, deserve what they get. And I think, I won't advise you on how to work with politicians as much, but, I would say that, I think it's really important that your front line feels engaged. I mean, I had direct experience having planned a piece of road that we had worked with the neighborhood. It was a small piece of road. We had a bunch of traffic calming, proposed, and the community loved it, and it was going to slow down. It was an arterial, so it was going to slow down traffic on arterial, and it looked elegant and everything else. And then we only found out later from the operating standpoint that there wasn't a snow plow that would be able to go through it. So, life's little lessons. It's lovely to plan and design something. You might want to go talk to the people who have to actually operate it and maintain it. So that was a wonderful experience. So whenever we do stuff, we have to make sure that those that are going to end up looking after it are involved in the process, so that, the mistakes that you make if you're only, planning and designing something can be caught early enough so that you don't promise something you can't deliver. So, I mean, those are, and so at that, I never lost that lesson. I kind of used that on other major infrastructure to make sure that those that end up having to live with it, have a chance to provide their input to it. So, I mean, in terms of ideas as to how the federal government can better invest its money in infrastructure that will benefit Toronto, I'll give you my card, and you can maybe, join us for dinner tonight, because that would be whatever you have to suggest. But I think more and more, these tables, even though they're very complicated, and you're only as good as the people that are around the tables, and how willing they are to kind of, share information and be upfront in terms of what interests they have. And, like I say, I think I can't guarantee success in every case, but the approach is, there's only, I think if we positional bargain everything, we're going to get nowhere. So, I mean, I can insult you and you can insult me, and then we can walk away feeling both insulted. That's not going to accomplish a heck of a lot. At the end of the day, in the case of the subway conversation, there was a lot of conversation that was going on. Where we were 6 months ago and where we ended up is vastly different.
Yes?
Just to build on what you were saying, Chris, I think 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, we actually had a quite formal model within our federation to focus on what you were calling intersecting and common challenges, or sort of wicked problems that tend to concentrate in big urban centers, known as urban development agreements. Mm-hmm. And I know Enid actually did some work on urban development agreements in Vancouver and Winnipeg. Yes. That formally brought the three levels together in a very structured kind of 5-year agreement framework that really seemed to mobilize resources in a coordinated and concerted way. In Vancouver, it was dealing with the downtown east side issues. In Winnipeg, it was dealing with some of the core revitalization questions, but it could easily be updated to apply to the infrastructure questions that you're speaking about that are different in Toronto than they would be in the city I'm from, London, but that there's a common model here that we've forgotten about. And just the thoughts on that.
Well, I love the fact you raised it, because you're absolutely right. And those are the two cities that I think all of us are aware of, that, all levels of government with a clear common outcome in mind, and governance structures put in place and investments. I mean, that to me is, why reinvent the wheel? I think it lends itself to this kind of conversation. And again, I don't know if it has to be specific to just a Toronto. I mean, it could be specific to a transit discussion in Southern Ontario. So it's absolutely. I think that's and the good work that Eden and the group did in terms of looking at other transit models around the world and borrowing from that. Again, I don't think we have to spend 20 years we don't have 20 years, to be quite honest. I think we need to try and if we can, make this a topic of importance in this term of council, and this term of provincial government, and term of federal government. So, but that, you're absolutely right. I think it seems obvious.
I think that we're going to draw it to a close now. The one lesson that I would just like to highlight that you mentioned is getting people to rethink, to think differently about these issues. We are in quite a problematic situation with the constraints from a governance point of view, from a funding point of view, and this whole issue of managing the assets that we have with huge, huge growth coming at us. And it's a very difficult conversation given the political climate in North America. But it is, and to just conclude with that, on the governance theme, like Enid, I've done some work on comparative governance of transit systems, and the work I did at Woodrow Wilson, and I compared the DC system with the WMATA system with the MTA in New York and with Toronto's Metro links. And what was interesting was the structure itself didn't matter. Every city has its own unique situation. DC is very complicated governance, but because there was a common set of values, they were able to come together and agree on what the plan should look like. So underneath it all, if we can get people to agree on the challenges and what they want to accomplish, there is hope. Thank you very much, Enid. I thought I would end on a note of hope. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much. And it's funny because as we started out, you were very pessimistic and Chris was very pessimistic, and I was thinking, how are we going to end this on an optimistic note? But we did end talking about partnerships, and that was pretty optimistic. And we talked about getting the message across to people, and I think that's a really important one. But it's not just the message, it's how we frame the message. You know, we always start with, we'll keep taxes low. But we should be starting with, what kind of city do we want? And what does that look like? And what does that cost? And are we willing to pay for it? So it's not just getting the public involved, but it's framing the discussion in a positive way. And I think we need to think about that. So I'd like to thank Chris. That was terrific. You have so much more experience this year than last year, so we appreciate your insights. And what a bonus to have Anne with us today. So thank you both for a really terrific discussion and hearing both of your perspectives.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Last thing, we do videos of our events, as you know, so that will be available on our website in a couple of weeks. Please share it with your colleagues who couldn't attend today's event. Or if you didn't hear something quite right, you can go back and replay it. But thank you for coming and have a great evening.
Great.